Shabbat Shalom. Last spring, I had the privilege of studying and living abroad in Copenhagen, Denmark. Over the course of my spring semester, I had the chance to visit 12 different countries, and in each one, I made a point to attend or lead some part of a service in each country. On one particularly damp Saturday morning last February, I found myself walking up the steep cobblestone streets of the super suburbs of Brussels. After entering through a massive steel-plated door and chatting with a rather large security guard, I found myself in the most beautiful window-lined Belgian sanctuary. After chatting briefly with the rabbi, who I had emailed the week prior, speaking, and I should add, broken high school French, he invited me to lead the Torah service for the community. There was something remarkable about singing with this Reform community in Brussels. Ein Kamocha was still Ein Kamocha. But there was also something really particular about the Belgian folk culture which shone through the service. And it made me think really critically about the differences. Prayer in Belgium was not the outward declaration of collective pride we're used to here at TBE, but rather a deeply personal, deeply introspective morning of meditation. Living abroad, the constant juxtaposition of the familiar with the new led me to think critically about my own upbringing and made me want to return to the folk traditions of my own childhood. In debriefing and discussing and picking apart with my Brandeis Jewish Studies faculty, I became fascinated with the origins and development of our own Reform Jewish expressions of prayer and music. And for those of you who know me best, music is always on the mind. And so when returning to this week's Torah portion, the musical folk tradition of the Parsha jumped off the page. So we have made it to the end of the book of Leviticus. This week is a double Parsha. We have Behar and Bechukotai. In the first portion, Behar, it's a Parsha of sacred pausing. We hear of Shemitah, the sabbatical year when the land rests itself. We read of Yovel, the Jubilee when debts are forgiven, when the enslaved go free, and when everyone is to return to their ancestral holding. There's something about this world of Behar, a world that breathes, a world that rests. And then we turn the page to Bechukotai, which begins by God telling the Israelites, if you walk in my ways, then blessings will rain upon you. And if you don't, all of these consequences will ensue. What struck me while studying this week was the almost unemotional architecture of the Parsha, a divine if-then statement, if you will. In the later part of the Parsha, we read, Ve'im lo tishme'u ve'lo tasu et kol hamitzvot ha'eleh. But if you do not obey me and observe all of these commandments. And after this opening, God lays out a cascade of consequences, each more devastating than the last. And each more devastating than the last. Illness, defeat, famine, exile, desolation so complete that we read the land will rest in the silence of abandonment. Over time, this section of Leviticus became known as tochecha. The word tochecha comes from the Hebrew word meaning rebuke or reproach. It appears twice in the Torah, once in Leviticus and then once again in Deuteronomy. And in the following verses, there is a clarity here that doesn't exist in much of our Jewish tradition. And that's deeply challenging, I think, as we, as the inheritors of this tradition, grapple with how to make sense of it. But as Reformed Jews, we don't just sit with tradition handed down. We have to understand the why behind each of our choices. Speaking of which, you may be also thinking, why was this rebuke what I wanted to speak of this evening in light of the beauty of the rest of Shabbat and the jubilee of the world? Well, the reason is this. When I read Tochecha and I heard God speaking plainly, I heard music come off the page. One of the most interesting folk traditions, I believe, within Jewish life happens on this particular Shabbat. If you walk into any synagogue where the Parsha is read, you'll notice something. Most often, when the Torah reader reaches the Tochecha, God's rebuke, their voice drops. They pull their talitot a little bit higher over their heads, and some congregations have developed the tradition of even whispering all 49 verses. As a musician, I just love when musical ritual emerges from within, not from a higher decree or halacha, but from something more human, from generation and generation of people grappling with what it means to be in conversation with text and feeling in their bones that our tradition has to be held differently. I'm fascinated with this tradition of tochecha because it's one of the most concrete examples in all of Jewish practice of people doing something really creative in response to something that candidly makes them feel bad. And that creativity is sacred. This is also how Vanessa Oakes tells the story of Judaism in her book, Inventing Jewish Ritual. She writes, "Our Judaism is a dynamic, evolving tradition, continuously sculpted by its loving practitioners." And she describes ritual innovators, which is us, not as people who abandoned tradition, but as people who asked the following questions. How does this live in our moment? Who is being left out? And what do these words need from us right now? She writes of musicians moving chants into Shabbat prayers and inviting people to get up into the pews and dance, come back at 8 p.m. And she writes of people who did not erase what came before, but elaborated, expanded, and breathed new life into our Jewish tradition. That is the story of American Reform Jewish music. And that is the story I have spent years studying. From the great, majestic cathedral-style worship of German classical Reform Judaism to the American folk revolution of the 60s and 70s when guitars entered the sanctuaries, every generation keeps answering the same question. How do we honor where we've been while answering where we are right now? In my oral history interviews, which formed the base of this research, I found an overwhelming desire among the practitioners of Jewish music to resolve this tension, to point to history and find a point where we've struck the perfect balance or answered the question. However, this evening, I'd like to offer that the tension of modernity is not actually something that we should seek to resolve. Sometimes, the work of meeting the moment, of creating cultural responsive and deeply alive Judaism is not a destination, but rather a living process which defines us as Reformed Jews. In a few hours, we will do something quite exciting together. At least I think so. We will hear the music that lives and breathes inside this research, a concert that tries to hold two things at once: the tradition handed down and the hands that are holding it forward. We'll walk these footsteps through music, and just like our ancestors, get through them, sometimes stammering, sometimes whispering, and never quite stopping. Throughout my life, I have found myself constantly returning to one central question when exploring Jewish thought. Why did one of my ancestors need this? In my thesis, why did we need the organ in the sanctuary or the folk guitar or the whispered rebuke or the quiet head covering of tochecha? What was that giving to people? Well, I surely don't have the answer for you this evening, but I do think we can come together to honor where we've been and to sing and to pray and to breathe new life into our ancient tradition. As Reformed Jews, we are called, as Vanessa Oakes says, to extend our tradition according to our own creativity, to build on the flexibilities of those who came before us. In other words, we are called to be culturally responsive, to ask who is being left behind, who needs to be gathered in, and how we can champion each other across the distances pulling us apart. That is the story of our tradition, with the babies and all. That is the story of this music, and I believe with everything I have that that is the story that we are writing each and every day together. I hope you will join us at 8 p.m. in the sanctuary as we explore the oral history of the music of the Reform Synagogue. May the Shabbat ahead be one of rest, one of sacred song, and one filled with those you love most. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Yasher Koach, Zach. Thank you.